If overtourism became the buzzword in the travel industry in 2019, the opposite applies in 2020, when most of the world's most popular tourist magnets are now facing a genuine economic crisis, forced on them by government closures and a risk-averse travel public, most of whom are prevented from travel beyond their own borders. Despite the perils of over-tourism and all sorts of plans to limit the rising foot traffic, nothing could have prepared these bucket list locations for the challenge they now face. Travel bans, quarantines and nationwide lockdowns are forcing travellers to stay home and face their own domestic economic issues. Travel is a long way down the list now for much of the world's middle class. The sea of terracotta roofs, the Old Town and its association with Game of Thrones has led the Croatian capital of Dubrovnik to a whole new surge of mass tourism in recent years. Last year, nearly 20 million people visited Croatia, almost all of them from other European countries, 1.5 million of them to Dubrovnik. The town's tourism was fed through weekend traffic and thousands of cruise ship day trippers. To try and control the situation, new regulations came into place at the start of this year to restrict the number of cruise ships in the old port to just 2 at a time. A ban on new outdoor dining was also proposed, and up to 80% of the city's souvenir shops were closed down. But in March, the situation changed as the city lost all its tourist footfall. After tentatively reopening for summer, the local Croatians began visiting again, and then a dribble of international traffic. But that's all changed now as the latest wave closed down much of Europe's tourist magnets. Whilst keen not to revisit the start of the year's over-tourism problem, the city's tourist leaders are saying they're now happy to welcome anyone, although they've set out to attract the luxury tourism sector in the future. Spain's Barcelona, with the soaring Gaudi spires, alfresco bars and stretches of beaches, really hit its tourism straps after the 1992 Olympic Games, when the diving competition showcased Barcelona's beauty to an international audience. Earlier this year, tourism was contributing up to 15% of the city's GDP and providing 10% of the jobs. But the pandemic has forced a re-evaluation for the city's tourist chiefs, who are trying to ensure that the locals can enjoy the spoils of tourism whilst still enjoying their own city. But by September this year, international tourism was down by 77%. Now the city, like Europe's other touristy cities, is struggling to quash a new surge of COVID-19 cases. A nighttime curfew is now in place to try and stem the rising figures. If not for the world pandemic, the party music would still be breaking the silence of Spain's Balearic Islands, with young Europeans stomping on the sandy beaches, bars and mega clubs of Ibiza. Instead, Mallorca, Menorca, Ibiza and Formentera remain quiet and devoid of tourists. Without the trademark thump-thump of the all-night parties, the islands are struggling to reinvent themselves in the COVID era. Thanks to a summer of COVID quarantines, muted nightclubs and cancelled flights, the Balearic Islands are suffering from the worst hangover they've ever experienced. Now the situation is prompting locals and businesses who rely on income generated by the nightlife to reconsider a future without it. The pandemic forced Ibiza's largest venues to stay closed, and it's feared that some may never reopen. The party is over for now, as tourism officials try to reinvent the industry and focus on the island's bohemian heritage rather than its hedonistic party scene. Machu Picchu, the 2,430-metre-high mountain ridge in Peru, has largely been out of bounds to tourists since the beginning of the pandemic. Before then, it attracted around 500,000 visitors every year. It became a tourist mecca with its archaeological wonders and stunning views. But Peru went into a strict lockdown on March the 15th, then was going to be reopened to domestic tourists in June, but a new surge of COVID cases kept the old Inca city closed to the world. But after a single international traveller was granted permission to ascend the mountain in early October, the plan is for Machu Picchu to reopen again in November as international flights to Peru recommence. One of the new rules is that there's going to be only 75 people in Machu Picchu at a time, dropping tourist numbers from over 5,000 a day to a cap of 675. Canals, and tourists. Lots of tourists. When it comes to over-tourism, Venice does it better than most. After decades of rising numbers of tourists, the locals started fighting back, fearing it was becoming more of a cruise ship theme park. COVID merely helped them cut off the tourist supply. In 2019, Venice attracted nearly 30 million tourists, all to the one city. A day trip fee was also being added to try and stem the flood of tourists. Well, that's now been shelved as the city is happy to greet any tourist at all, with Italy again facing lockdowns. Northern Italy became the first main European spot to face the first brutal brunt of COVID-19 at the end of February. Venice went into lockdown and has spent most of the year tourist-free. Even when the borders were prized open in summer, the numbers were in low thousands instead of the 80 to 90,000 per day in the past. At its peak, around 30,000 of those daily tourists were off cruise ships. Thailand's most popular tropical island, Phuket, is facing an existential calamity with its almost complete reliance on tourist traffic. After the Thai government pulled down the border shutters at the end of March, the tourist taps stopped flowing and Phuket's popular beach towns like Patong, Kata, Karon and Surin turned into virtual ghost towns. More than 100,000 of the island's workforce, about half, left the island over the next few months to try and find other work. Whilst the touristy west coast still remains devoid of tourists, the locals living on the east coast are reinventing their lives, starting new businesses and figuring out how Phuket can evolve into something other than just a southern island tourist trap. The island finds itself in a strange position because whilst Phuket and Thailand generally has been able to almost completely contain the coronavirus, the Thai government is keeping a tight control on the borders and who it allows in. Domestic tourism has been allowed again since the start of July, but the handful of expats, international visitors stuck in Thailand during the pandemic, and local Thais are providing just a tiny dribble of tourist traffic compared to the island's heyday when it would welcome 12 or so million visitors every year. The situation is much the same for Southeast Asia's other tropical island tourist magnets, Bali in Indonesia, Boracay in the Philippines, and Koh Samui in Thailand. Even the new player in the tropical island bucket list, Vietnam's Phuoc, has dropped from a 2019 250,000 international tourist high to nothing. The island's 2.5 million domestic visitors per year has also dropped to a trickle. The Indonesian island of Bali is likely to remain closed to international tourists until at least next year, missing an entire Christmas and New Year season. For now, you can only visit Bali on specific visas, and there are strict restrictions in place on the island about wearing masks and closing bars early. Koh Samui, Thailand's second biggest island, has been devastated by the response to the pandemic. Like Phuket, it was heavily dependent on international tourist traffic, and thousands of businesses are now facing ruin. With only one airline flying into the island, still trying to milk its monopoly, Koh Samui faces a bleak future. Last year, the spectacular Greek island of Santorini attracted 2.8 million visitors. This year, it's been a very different story. Just one of the popular Greek islands, the cliffside white and blue main town, the seafood and the sunsets, Santorini had it all. But following Greece's first 3 cases of COVID-19 on February the 27th, Greek authorities swiftly put restrictions in place, including closing off the famous islands. After emerging from its lockdown on May the 4th, the Santorinians were hoping that it was in time for a summer resurge of tourism. But the rest of the world wasn't ready to travel, and despite visitors being able to return to the Greek islands, most are still staying away, putting island tourist businesses in peril as they enter another winter season. The July to September high season just didn't happen. At this stage, no one knows how or when all these tourist meccas are going to reopen, or even if the world's multi-billion-dollar tourist industry will ever recover. In the years and decades ahead, there will certainly be a recovery, but to what extent? The entire tourist machinery is largely in ruins, from the travel agents to the hotels to the airlines that take the tourists to their favourite locations. Even if there was some sudden cure or a magic vaccine for COVID-19, it will take years to get all the cogs back in motion to deliver tourists back to the islands, cities and hotspots around the globe. But there will surely be a reappraisal of how these tourist magnates run their tourist industries in the future and ensure that their reliance alone on the tourist dollar is matched with a more sustainable local economic model. At least in the short term, they can't possibly survive on the hope tourists are going to be returning anytime soon.